And with that prayer, I would like to welcome our guest today, Professor Ramesh Raoji. Namaste, Professor Ramesh Rao.
Namaste, namaskar.
So welcome to another session of Indica Conversations. For that, today we have a webinar by Professor Ramesh Raoji. The topic for our conversation today is representation of India in Western media. Quickly, I would like to talk about Indica, what we do here in Indica. So we are a non-traditional university for traditional knowledge. We seek to build a global renaissance based on Indic civilizational thought. We are pursuing a multi-dimensional strategy across time, space, and cause by establishing centers of excellence, transforming intellectuals, and building the ecosystem. We are a 501c3 not-for-profit organization here in the US, and all contributions made to it are tax exempt. Please visit us on our website at www.indicacademy.org. Explore and navigate our activities, platforms, and initiatives. Please also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all the social media handles. Our handle there is Indic Academy, at Indic Academy. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker today. So Professor Rao teaches communication at Columbus State University in Columbus, Georgia. He has been teaching in the US since 1987 and has offered courses ranging from public speaking and interpersonal communication to media, law, and intercultural communication. He's the co-author of the book, Intellectual Communication, The Indian Context, and the author of a number of books on Indian politics and society. He also writes op-eds, essays, and now is a columnist for Surf News. You can access some of his old op-eds and essays on www.rameshrao/n.com, home/page/53. We'll put that up in the chat so you can click on it. He lives in Fortson, Georgia with his wife Sujaya and son Sudhanwa. Did I pronounce that correctly, Professor Rao?
You got it right.
Okay, thank you. So welcome everybody. Before we start, quickly, I would like all of you, except for Professor Rao, to turn your video and microphone off. And please do not say anything during the conversation. Keep the mics turned off. If you have any questions or concerns, please put that in chat. Also use the raise hand feature of Zoom if you have to say something. Also, please keep telling us once you log on where you have logged in from. So that helps us ensure that, for next coming webinar, so we are more prepared, better prepared for hosting that. So with that saying, I will turn the screen to Professor Rao. Welcome, Professor Rao.
Good morning, Suprabhatam. Good day. I know people may be joining from around the world. Good to have all of you this morning. And I hope what I have to share with you today and maybe the questions that you have for me today will throw a little bit more light on the way we have been covered by the media. And when I say Western media, of course, I focus mostly on the United States and of course, Europe. But sometimes, given the global context these days, media are all over, situated all over, and therefore sometimes it is kind of difficult to demarcate the West from the rest. So this morning, I came across a news item, a video, pictorial in the Washington Post. The title is "Like a Land of Permanent Sorrow." A visiting Indian photographer documents life in Kashmir. It is mostly a series of dark photographs about life as intimidating in Kashmir. Though it says a visiting Indian photographer, it is a combination of an Indian and a Western photographer. Then yesterday I saw a piece in the Atlantic Monthly. The title is "India is No Longer India." It is by Atish Tasir, who is now based in the New York Times, and I won't go into his antecedents, but this is something that I've seen over the past few years now, that Atish has been grinding the same stone over and over again, but that it gets to be published over and over again is also kind of interesting. So we can look at this kind of day-to-day media coverage, maybe get frustrated or angry or disappointed, make a few comments on WhatsApp or social media and go on. Or if we are to kind of really try to understand what is happening, we may have to kind of step back and do the kinds of work that is necessary to really understand the dynamic that is present now. Of course, India has been covered. India has been a very attractive land for a long, long time. You have Al-Baruni writing wonderful things about the wonderful India that was then. And of course, you have Catherine Mayo, as Gandhiji said, who wrote a drain inspector's report. So India has had coverage for a long time. So what is different now? And can we do our study methodically, programmatically, so that we begin to understand what is happening? Not all coverage is bad at all times. So when is that coverage good? When is it bad? But more importantly, to try and understand, what really is maybe the ideological or kind of an aspirational goal that others have for India. Okay, so let me start with the screen here. Everyone able to? Okay. Back in 1999, I came across this headline, which says, "Shiva versus Jesus, Hindus burn homes of Christians." I was thunderstruck when I first read the headline. And I said, really interesting. Is there any such example of a headline that identifies a religion, a religious group, and has this kind of provocative nature? So here, Shiva versus Jesus, Hindus burn homes of Christians. This
Professor Rao, can I interrupt you real quick? Can
Yes.
you make your slide full screen, please?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry about that.
Okay, and let me see if I can, okay. Is this better now? Okay, so Um, this was a report by Celia Duggar, and I thought immediately, would they indeed have a title for one of the reports like Muhammad versus Jesus, Muslims slit Christians' throats, or Jesus versus Yahweh, Christians slaughter Jews in Pittsburgh synagogue, Muhammad versus Parvati, Muslims rape Hindu women. I scoured the New York Times archives and really did not come across anything that was so provocative and that specifically identified a religious group targeting another religious group. So I thought more about it. And I said, is this a one-time aberration? And so back in 2001, I did my first study of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I just looked at the editorials about how they had covered Indian matters between 1999 and 2001. And even then I found out that the New York Times was not only more critical, but completely negative in its coverage through its editorials. The Washington Post then was kind of more middle ground. So I have been watching Western media since I have been teaching here in the US since 1987. And I therefore began writing about it. And more recently I said, okay, since I have collected so much data, let me try and collate this. Let me try and analyze this. So I looked for what has been happening in terms of the New York Times coverage. I have also done this for in terms of the coverage of National Public Radio. I plan to do that for the Washington Post. But this cannot be a one-man journey. It needs a lot of academics, a lot of scholars, a lot of activists, a lot of writers to be involved in, as I said, a more programmatic analysis of the coverage of India by Western media. So when I looked for more headlines, I came across these. Hindu cow vigilantes in Rajasthan, India, beat Muslims to death. Here again, a carefully calibrated headline that identifies religious groups, it identifies the victim, and it is provocative in nature. Next one I came across was anti-Muslim venom fuels rise to power in India. Forced to chant Hindu slogans, Muslim man is beaten to death. Hindu-led India puts clamp on Muslim Kashmir. India plans big detention camps for migrants. Muslims are afraid. Now, again, we may say, those of us who are skeptical about any kind of a campaign of defamation or targeting, saying, the New York Times has its ideological slant. It is left of center. It criticizes others. So what? But again, it is very important to compare these headlines with others that they use and to see whether they have similar headlines where, for example, a Muslim group targets a Christian group or a Hindu group, or a Christian group targets others. And I found none. And here again, those of you who do watch the news and who do watch some of the coverage of India, we found out last year, especially because of the elections, there was a whole bunch of coverage from National Public Radio, and they had a series of articles, op-ed comments, and even though NPR is a radio channel, they also had a lot of reports on their website. And one of their correspondents in New Delhi happened to be Furqan Khan, who tweeted, if Indians give up Hinduism, they will also be solving most of their problems. What with all the piss drinking and dung worshipping. Now, this is not a reader. This is not someone, a troll. This is National Public Radio's New Delhi correspondent. And if you go to the NPR site to this day, now you will see all of our articles still there on the site. People complained. Furqan Khan was let go. But then again, if you look at the NPR website, there is not one mention of this particular post about NPR asking this person to resign. The apology that NPR gave is nowhere on the site. And then some of my colleagues, some activists who got in touch with NPR, tried to engage them and were told, oh, okay, we will work with you. After 3 months, there is nothing. So we will have to kind of consider, what is happening here? And if you look again at the coverage that was done of India last year, programmatically, then there is something else going on. Very quickly, I'll take about 10 minutes to kind of scroll through a few headlines so that I want to make the case here. First, that these are not headlines that are kind of, once in a while aberrations, but there is a kind of a campaign here that highlights Hindu criminality, Hindu action that is targeted, that is aimed at others. Okay, so we have this Hindu priest with a history of bigotry selected to run India's Uttar Pradesh. We all know who they are targeting. But again, take a look at the title, Hindu priest with a history of bigotry. Next one, vigilantes in India, protecting sacred cows, promoting a Hindu way of life. India is changing some cities' names and Muslims fear their heritage. Their heritage is being erased. What about this? You can say, oh, well, and the New York Times criticizes Trump. They have been bitterly, mockingly, taking shots at him. They have criticized Brazil's President Bolsonaro, and they have criticized the president of the Philippines. They also regularly have reports targeting nationalist right-wing governments, parties, and movements. And would not the criticism of the India BJP Hindu kind of dynamic right now, similar to the kind of criticism that they have made of others? At this point, I think it's very important to kind of step back and say, how have the media kind of presented the world to its readers, to its viewers, to its listeners? We find out that, the media do set agendas. We have a whole theoretical framework called agenda setting. What does that mean? So the media is supposed to be the fourth estate. We have the first three estates, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and the media is supposed to kind of keep watch over them and to ensure that those first three estates do their work in a proper way, and that if anything goes wrong, any criticism has to be made. It's the media who does the watching. But then the fourth estate, if it has its own agenda, that means its plan for society, then we need to acknowledge that. And in the past, in the US, for example, almost every town had its own newspapers, and there were newspapers that, slanted left or right or were centrist. But now, unless we understand that the media seek to influence viewers and readers, and that they do it by what we call framing, kind of a selection of news items. They also do this by what we call gatekeeping. They will allow some reporting or reports, and they will block some. They will block certain news, certain views. So once again, is this not what we call traditional kind of bias in the media? So this is, I think, where we need to kind of say, Western media's approach to India, to the coverage of India, goes beyond traditional bias. And I point out to Balagangadhara's work, where he says the kind of colonial consciousness. And again, I think it's a mistake that so many Indians make, that, oh, India was colonized for 2 centuries by the British. No, India has been colonized, over centuries. And that kind of, as I said, coverage of India by others has been going on for a long, long time. And Balagangadhara points out to Edward Said's book, Covering Islam, that became famous. That was first published in 1970, actually. Where Edward Said kind of looks at how the West has covered Islam and the Muslim world. And interestingly, now it seems like the West is bending over backwards to appease the Muslim world, and has found a kind of a new villain, as it were, in Hindus and Hinduism. And I also kind of looked at the work by Ronald Inden. And I would really suggest, for those of you who are interested in studying about how India has been covered by colonial observers, whether it is Christian priests or academics or administrators, how did they present India? And Inden's book called Imagining India is in fact a fascinating book, and I would really suggest to those who are serious about these matters to kind of start with this book. And he says that the discourse constructed by hegemonic agents, and these are basically what? These are colonialists. These are, again, those priests, those administrators, those academics who wanted to study India. He calls them hegemonic agents. And these are, people who are basically dominating the discussion about someone else. And it's not the someone else who is himself or herself talking about themselves, but it is the others observing them and their observation getting primacy, instead of, it is not my telling my story, making it available, but that you tell my story, and that your telling of my story is more dominant than my attempt to tell my own story. He says a genuine critic of Orientalism does not revolve around the question of prejudice or bias, or of a lack either of objectivity or of empathy. Emotions, attitudes, and values are an important part of Orientalist discourse, but they are not coterminous with the structure of ideas that constitutes Orientalism, or with the relationship of dominance embedded in the structure. So what he basically says is, look, if I were to kind of take a look at how the New York Times or NPR or the BBC is covering India, it's not a simple matter of bias or prejudice. It is not a simple matter of objectivity. When we talk about reporting, we train. I was trained as a journalist. And when I tell my students, okay, reporters have to triangulate their sources. Make sure that you just don't go to one person or one group and ask for their response or for their take on a matter. Make sure that you have at least 2 or 3 people, so that you really get a sense of what is happening. So what Inden says is, look, it is not merely a lack of objectivity. It's not merely bias, but there is something else going on. And he says, what is going on is dominance. That is, the discourse of the Westerner is dominant. It overwhelms the natives, the indigenous person or community's own story and their own take on their own lives. So he says these hegemonic agents are not only successful in speaking for their own special interests, but they speak for others because these groups themselves become complicit in the process of such discourse production. Let me unpack that. So if you look at the New York Times, many of the New York Times op-ed pieces or the NPR reporters from India, these are Indian Americans or Indians. So what Indian interestingly and correctly points out is that the Western agent, the hegemonic agent, is successful in terms of presenting the picture of India, not because the Western other himself is writing about it, but they have their ideas about reality, about what is scientific, what is correct, has now been absorbed by the natives themselves. So what you now find is that these Indian reporters, these Indian writers, merely aping and imitating and presenting the Western view of themselves and claiming that is the only way to look at themselves. So they're complicit in the sense that they basically accept the premises of this Orientalist hegemonic discourse. And we can see, and here again, Indian is very insightful when he says these texts are just as often as used by fractions of the ruled against one another, they're often taken as positions by the ruled among themselves around which to rally. So if you can look at this, and when I talk to friends and family and colleagues here, they say, oh, after all, you have this kind of critical take about the BJP or Hindus or Hinduism by Indians themselves. What is different? And this is where I think when we step back and look at this and see how Western discourse has been normalized, that we think that is the only way, that Western approach of way of looking at life is real, is what we, to use the term veridical, that they reflect reality completely and correctly. Okay, and that I think is something that we need to therefore pay very close attention to, as to how we have ourselves begun to look at us using the lens that the West has prepared for us. Okay, so what do I suggest? So instead of simply kind of responding to single articles, we need more careful evaluation. We need to collate data. We need to do some careful programmatic studies of this. We must build our case systematically, and this is what I have tried to do in my conference papers. I have got a journal article out now, and this is something I have begun to write for popular platforms. So what did I do? I for example, here again, as an academic, or if you are simply a subscriber to the New York Times, you have to give them some money. You will access their archives. Once you access their archives, you can do a variety of search, using search items, search terms, and this is what I did for a study that I just presented last month. Okay, I looked at the period spanning 2017 to 2019 in terms of the New York Times coverage of India, and I found some, really interesting stuff. Okay, suddenly, and this is something that I would suggest for to those people who are really serious about this, that if you want to do this kind of study, you may want to kind of take a look at how the New York Times covered India between 2005 and 2015, when the Congress Party, Manmohan Singh-led government, administered, was in charge of India. How is that different from how they have covered between 2015 and now? I did an analysis of how the New York Times and the Washington Post covered the Vajpayee led NDA government between 1998 and 2004. So these are ways of comparing. I think that will reveal, the kinds of programs that Western media has for us and how they look at us and what they think is good for us. Okay, so here are some kind of numbers that, in terms of the number of articles that popped up when I use those kinds of search terms. Okay. Very quickly, I'll spend about 5 minutes, go through, some headlines once again, and then wrap this up. So by around 11:40 my time, then we can open up for some questions. Okay. Here again, the kinds of provocative titles of op-ed pieces and a couple of articles that I wrote recently. I just listed the writers of this opinion pieces. And a good friend of mine, who is a senior writer in India, was shocked. He said, it's just amazing how mediocre writers, people who have been, kicked out of reporting jobs here in India, have got the opportunity to write an opinion piece for the New York Times. And that they themselves had never been contacted by any of the New York Times Delhi-based correspondents for their views. I asked economic advisors to the government of India. I asked senior, editors who have been working, who have written literally thousands of articles on India. These experts, none of them have been contacted, but a certain kind of list of people that the New York Times favors in terms of how India should be presented to its readers around the world. So Sanskrit, spoken by few, but loved by Hindu nationalists, gets a boost. Here again, Hindu group claims Christians tried forced conversions in India. And this is where it's kind of interesting that the New York Times, despite its reporters and its correspondents in India knowing, for example, about the Joshua Project that has been going on for 3 decades now. And many say, in fact, the Joshua Project people have a better understanding about about Indian demographics than even the Indian census institution. These are basically Christian proselytizers. And here, interestingly, that one item that the New York Times presented, it is, there is no attempt at really finding out what is happening on the ground, but basically saying, oh, the Hindu groups claim that Christians are trying to, and again, they use the term forced conversions, okay? Here, anti-Muslim venom fuels rise to power in India, India's Muslims and the price of partition. And this is this particular opinion piece. The author is who I mentioned as this mediocre writer who had been who had an interesting kind of background. The next one, in India, journalists face slut shaming and rape threats. Rana Ayub, who now, interestingly, has been hired by the Washington Post as one of its global opinions, global opinion editor. And I point out that while this particular op-ed was published by the New York Times, columnist Shefali Vaidya, who also writes and tweets a lot, has been at the receiving end of abuses on social media. And the New York Times reporters, correspondents never reached out to her. And in their reporting about India, did not bother to contact and kind of, again, balance their reporting about these matters, okay? So I have done similar kind of collation of titles of reports, looked at how Christians and Christian life has been covered in India by the New York Times. So there too, and here again, I don't have all of the time to kind of analyze this, unpack this, but this is what I found. US to question India about ban on Christian charity. And of course, this, as you know, when the Narendra Modi government began to take a look at these NGOs and what they were up to and how they were diverting their funds for purposes that were not what they claimed was their true purpose, okay? And then Hindu group claims Christians try to force conversions in India. Christians in India face a backlash. We are afraid of Christmas. Tensions dampen holiday in India. In India, cultural divide stifles spirit of Christmas. Here again, there is nothing, not one particular article about the life of Christians in India that is presented to its global readers, okay? And then interestingly, that one Chinese American who went to the Andaman Islands seeking to convert the Sentinelese tribes, there were about 6 or 7 articles, reports published by the New York Times. And all of it were fairly sympathetic to this really foolhardy, if not criminal, young man who went there, broke all of India's rules, was involved basically in a criminal act by breaking those rules. And if he had indeed landed on those islands, would have basically led to the decimation of those tribes. Okay, so if you look at these titles too, there is nothing there that charges this young man with criminality or with foolishness or with endangering this isolated tribe. Okay, everything has got a positive spin on it. Okay, so what should we demand? At this particular point in time, we got to take a look and say, hey, in journalism school, we are told to be objective, balanced, avoid bias, avoid provoking readers, and triangulating sources. If the New York Times, if National Public Radio, if the BBC, if Associated Press doesn't offer or doesn't use these standards that are, classic reporting standards, and standards that even in the opinion pages. So for example, if you look at the New York Times opinion pages, they do hire also what we call conservative opinion writers. So you will have someone like David Brooks, Ross Douthat, who are on the regular, who are regular columnists for the New York Times. If they can have those people, why not also have people writing about India who have a different opinion than what has been presented over and over again? Okay. So as I say here, the NYT gives space to Brooks and Douthat and Stevens. No space is provided to Indian commentators. And this is where I really checked with some of my sources back in India. Have you been contacted? Has anyone, have you sent, pieces to the New York Times? What has been the response? And so none that I asked from top government advisors, editors, commentators had ever been asked for their opinions on Indian matters. They had not been invited to write for these sources. Okay. So to wrap this up, what can we do? We need to write more. We need to do more research. We need to train young people to do the kind of careful content analysis so that we simply don't use one example and charge these people with not mere bias, but with racism, with colonialist, imperialist kinds of attitudes. We need to make our case much more carefully. We need to build those databases. We need to be persistent and disciplined in understanding this, in recording this, in making sure that we really bring about a change. Okay, we can't do this in a kind of a, haphazard, once in a while kind of an approach. Okay, so Indian says the West continues to talk and write about others in the form of imperial knowledges, universal discourses that the world constitutes in cosmologies produced in those complex political spheres. And therefore, we need to kind of take a look, because the New York Times is seen as the newspaper of record. It is not merely some elite readers, but academics read the New York Times, politicians read the New York Times, and in fact, presidential candidates go to the New York Times, to their headquarters in New York, to be interviewed. And they're really very anxious and worried in terms of, whether they will really appeal to the New York Times editors. So the paper has that kind of power, and it has become that kind of authoritative voice. And if that authoritative voice is the one presenting these negative pictures about Hinduism, the present BJP-led government, we need to be asking some, serious questions. With that, let me see if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Rao. It was really a very exciting presentation. Before I open up the floor for questions, let me say that please, type your questions in the chat, and we'll try to go over them one by one, as many as possible throughout the conversation here. Please do not, try not to unmute yourself. This will help us, this presentation keep going forward. You mentioned, Dr. Rao, before I open up to the floor for everybody else, that we noticed that a lot of those people who are writing are not always, in fact, most of them are non-Indian. Most of them are Indians. And you kind of touched upon that, and you also said that but who are these people when we talk about them? Do you have any general idea about these kind of people who are writing? They're definitely Indians, but beyond that, who are these people?
Here again, I think we need to understand that in every country we have political divisions. Okay, so right, left, center. Predominantly Muslim, predominantly Hindu, predominantly Christian, predominantly Sikh, whatever. Okay, so societies are complex, and we have different voices. So the question is, whose voices get presented? Who gets to speak? And why are certain voices given primacy? I think that is very important. And surely if we look at Indian history, and those of us who have been following this, since the 1970s, Indian academic space, Indian media space has been dominated by the left. Okay, for a variety of reasons, people have been put in place. People will say Lutyens media, or will say the JNU gang, or whatever, but predominantly it has been a left tilting discourse. Okay. Now, but the left tilting discourse, or the liberal or progressive, or whatever they may label themselves, has kind of, why has that been given the space by Western media instead of, offering space for everyone? Okay. And here I think that's where what I simply say is not that certain voices, should not be given space, is that everyone should be given space. We need to have the space to make our case. If I can't make my case, if someone else is making it for me, then where is my, myself there? And therefore, I think it's extremely, relevant in this discussion as to why certain spaces and why certain voices are offered, and to whom.
Okay, so I'm gonna start reading some of the questions that people have typed. So one of the questions here is that where, to whom, and how do you reach out to these newspapers about these lopsided op-eds? K. Kumar KG is asking. So basically, as a consumer of these newspaper op-eds, what can we do beyond just, outraging in social media or Facebook and all that? Is there anything we can do concrete?
I think we see today, this morning, with the effort by Indic Academy, that we now have these kinds of platforms. What is much more, what is different now between when I started observing more carefully the Western media coverage of India in the mid to late 1990s, is that we have social media, we have the internet that allows us to leverage this, these new platforms, these new venues. And if we do this in a careful, organized, methodical manner, we are going to break through that kind of dense wall, ideological wall that they have surrounded themselves with. Now, it also takes for young scholars, young activists to do this carefully, okay? It is very easy to, forward some WhatsApp message, okay? But it takes a lot more effort to sit down every day, 3 hours in front of your computer, write articles, collate data. That takes effort. Like anything else, if you want to be a good musician, you got to practice 6 hours a day. There is no other way around that. And I think, and here again, I think, angry readers are important, angry viewers are important because they are expressing stuff. But we also need to do this in a systematic way, because only then will we have those kinds of academics, trained scholars who can respond to the world, in a careful, systematic way.
Thank you. That kind of gives a segue to the next question we have, is that what are some of the alternatives for the people who want to actually do some work and present their works, even if they are not scholars or professors? Are there alternative mediums available? So this is asked by Shyam Nand Kumar.
Okay. Yes, and actually these days, it's much more easy, not only to, to do your own blogs and so on, have your own websites. But for example, an outlet like medium.com, where you can actually publish, and even, if your articles are good enough, you could have millions of readers and you could make quite a bit of money too. So it's a question of finding out those kinds of venues. And again, we need to prepare ourselves. Not everyone has the capacity, immediately, even when I write articles these days, it goes through at least 2 or 3 iterations before I send it off, or before I publish it on Medium, okay? Or before I send it to Surf News. Or when I do a presentation at a conference, my first 2, 3, drafts are drafts. So writing is difficult. Speaking can be a challenge for those of us who are not trained. And these things, again, we need to pay attention, acquire those kinds of skills, and test it, and do that, thoughtfully and with persistence.
Thank you. Yeah, on that end, I would like to also mention here that we organize through Indic Academy several writers' workshops. So actually, people who are interested should invest some time and some resources as well to hone their skills so they are able to write more effectively. Next question is from Kiran. He's asking basically is if there are some monetary incentives for people who are writing the kind of articles they're writing for, so to speak, like follow the money kind of thing.
Okay.
Do you have any, insight on that?
Yeah. These days, because everyone that I know seems to be writing, a lot of people are writing. It is a buyer's market. So, people are, I don't get paid for most of what I write. Okay. But it is important to write. And if you become a good enough writer, if you are a skilled enough writer and commentator, you will be rewarded. But that can, here again, I mentioned, a platform like Medium. Yes, you can publish there. And if your article is popular, so for example, that Stanford trained engineer who wrote about the coronavirus, that was shared a few million times. So surely Medium would have paid him quite a bit of money because of that many views. So yes, there are rewards, but that can, that comes later. And I think it is very important first to acquire skills, to read regularly. And that's the other thing that I found. So many Indians read sporadically, don't go beyond the headlines, don't care to read people who are, trying very hard to change the narrative. Okay, if my articles are not read by my own friends, then that means I'm not breaking through that kind of either apathy or ignorance.
All right. Anil Kumar asks, should we not analyze that how Muslims were able to get a positive coverage? Was it oil money?
That is a fascinating question. It's a very interesting observation because, and of course, my good friend Conrad Elst has written something about Islamophilism and Islamophobia. And those who profess love of Islam are the ones who have bombed Muslim societies and countries to smithereens, whether it is Barack Obama or George Bush or Bill Clinton. Whereas those who are termed Islamophobes, people who criticize, aspects of, fundamentalist Islam have done no harm, except that they are seeking to have, moderation, in terms of our religious ideology. What is interesting in terms of the West, and as I mentioned, Edward Said, he taught at Columbia University, and he taught there for a long time, and his covering Islam became hugely popular, and it took a few decades. Now, yes, we see, again, if you look at the New York Times, one of their opinion editors is Basharat Peer, who is a Kashmiri Indian, and who is also part of particular groups that they call themselves progressive, and you can see basically the hand of Basharat Peer in terms of the kinds of op-ed pieces that are published in the New York Times. Or as I mentioned, Rana Ayub, who is a global opinions editor for the Washington Post. Now, this has become, par for the course, whether in academia or media or in public spaces, and rightly so. We should not be demonizing any group. We should be targeting, violent crimes and violent ideologies. Okay, and if we do that, then I think everything is fair. But this kind of bending over backwards and shutting out all criticism of all valid criticism against Islamists. And when I say Islamists, these are the fundamentalists, Muslim preachers and activists who seek to bring, their own version of their violent world to the rest of the world. If we can't even criticize that, then that means we have, really ignored what it means to be balanced.
Thank you. I think the next question was Dheeraj Shah. It's the similar question, so I'll skip that. Next one is Ram. Ram, can you go ahead and ask your question yourself? You're the co-host here.
All right, I'm going to read out, Professor. What can we do to change the negative discourse? Do we start writing mass letters to the editor? Will that help? Is it not few levels above the editorial pay grade here, actually? What's the conspiracy?
Yeah, I think, I have tried writing letters to the editor and, been frustrated because, and again, in terms of letters to the editor, there is a limited space. But once again, and there is a rare letter, and, I do have them in my archives where there is a little bit of pushback allowed. And of course, these days we have this whole, petitions that we can, change.org or whatever. We can build up that kind of momentum so people do get to hear. But I think the big challenge in India is simply because, again, the Indian left liberal progressive cabals have basically adopted the Western hegemonic worldview about who a Hindu is, what Hinduism is, and what, quote unquote, a Hindu nationalist government is all about. So when you have that powerful an influence and that deep rooted press, occupation of academe and media spaces, then it is a challenge. And this is where I think, it all depends on how many readers we get, how many viewers we get, whether it is, for a magazine like Swarajya, or whether it is, any of those kinds of writers who are, providing a different kind of narrative. So we need to really, put our monies where our mouths are, do that kind of due diligence, and be critical, and again, it should not be knee-jerk. We have to be careful and balanced in our analysis. And if we do that, we will get, we will find that space and we will make that space.
Before we move on to the next question, our other co-host, Nishant, he wants to make an announcement. He wants to say something. Nishanji, can you come in, please?
Oh, no, I actually just wanted to say we are going to run a few minutes over because we have a lot of questions still. I think we have 4 more questions. Yeah. So if everybody can hang on in, we'll just take a few more minutes and wrap this up.
Did you have any question, Nishanji?
No, not at this time.
Okay. All right. So next question is from Bharat or Bharat. And no, hold on just a second. I scrolled up. Sri Srinath, is Rajiv Malhotra's Breaking India not too far-fetched? I have from a very reliable source in the Western intelligence community saying that breaking India is just a matter of time and a goal of some powers in the shadow. What is your take on this?
I mean, India has always been an attractive place for marauders. This is not anything new, It's a beautiful land. It's a fertile land. It is a land of great cultural, civilizational, history. And its people are brilliant. And yes, and of course, the biggest challenge, not just for India, and this is something that I have written in some of my commentaries, once you have what I call monopolistic, monotheistic ideologies then it is their logic that they prevail. Okay, and when I say monotheistic, it need not be just theism. Even when you have a monopolist ideology like Marxism or communism, which means that you cannot rest until you make the world, communist. You cannot rest until you make the world Christian, because again, it is not what Ramesh Rao is saying, it is what Christians themselves, when they go to church and ask to spread the word of Jesus, or when you go to a mosque and ask to spread the word of, Muhammad, what is the end goal? It is to make the world, as I said, Marxist or Christian or Muslim. And it's not just those three. Those are the three big groups. Any monopolist or monotheistic ideology, anyone who seeks to convert another, is involved in that kind of program. That is their worldview. I want to make the world, Baha'i, for example. I used to go to Washington, D.C. every 3 months to attend the Freedom House meeting on religious freedom. Everyone around that table, very big table, seating about 40 people, I was the only one representing a non-proselytizing faith group. Yeah. Now, that is the nature of ideologies that are monopolist. So we Hindus, we need to keep saying, diversity really means diversity of views. Okay, and that, God may be one, the Supreme may be one, but there are many ways of approaching him, her, it, the cosmos. Okay, we have a beautiful, fantastic, and really world-embracing kind of an approach to the world. If we don't, keep telling the world about this, then, we will have to kind of, see, with clear eyes that a monopoly, whatever, a business monopoly or a religious monopoly, what they seek to do is to occupy the complete space.
Thank you. I just another quick observation. Since you mentioned, people, we have everything in India. People have been coming there for a long time for different reasons. But one of the assets that we keep ignoring or advertising that people came for is our intellectual tradition, the intellectual property that India has, and it doesn't get advertised as much as just the wealth or the silk or the spices. So I just wanted to make that point. And before I go, go to the next question. Will it be possible for you, Professor Rao, to mention the names of the books that you listed in the presentation? Indian's book, Balu's book, and Edward Said's book. Names of those books, please.
I would, I think the most accessible book, and that which I would, really like, scholars and writers to, take a look at, is Ronald Inden's book, which is Imagining India. And Ronald Inden is a student of Mackim Marriott, who taught at the University of Chicago, and very recently, and he was people, I think he turned 90, and then his students met and commemorated and so on. So Inden was influenced by Marriott, and Mackim Marriott was one of those anthropologists who really believed in, basically changing anthropology so that the indigenous person, the other, spoke for himself or herself. Okay, that movement in anthropology has been going on, since the 1980s, and I think here again, I think the challenge for India is that we have begun to speak like the like the Western imperialist others. So it is going to be a challenge in terms of ensuring that the Indian space is cleared first. When I say cleared, not to marginalize anyone, but to make space for all. Okay, so that there is a real debate, Vada, I believe This is a book that I've been reading recently, something that I'll be writing about also. Vada has been the tradition in India. Debate, discussion. That's how people change their worldview once a philosopher was able to defeat in debate another person. That is the tradition of India. And that great tradition of Vada should continue.
Yeah, very good point, Professor Rao. Yes, I remember talking to Professor Arvind Sharma, and he was also mentioning that our lens that you talked about has changed so much that we have started talking in those terms. The vocabulary, our vocabulary has changed. For example, we use the word religion, you know, it's overwhelmingly used and used indiscriminately, which is, a problem. But okay, next question is from Bharat. There are many who do not go beyond headlines. Is there a write-up of a framework for analysis for the uninitiated to analyze these articles' headlines?
Yeah, I suppose we could come up with an executive summary for the, for those who either don't have the bandwidth or who don't have the patience. And this is where I think, and it's not just me who is writing. There are, good people like, Indu Vishwanathan, Vamsi Chaluri, others who have also been writing about how, India is covered by Western media. There are others, it is very important that we continue to write. And, and I suppose, and this is the irony, maybe this is the tragedy, that so many modern Indians have simply gotten into this WhatsApp habit where, just, skimming through a line or two, that does not make for an intelligent society. So we need to spend some time reading.
Yeah, and that reminds me, Professor Jeffrey Long, he has also written a paper on Hindu phobia from a perspective of academic and a follower. That gives you some kind of framework to work with. So I would recommend everybody to take a look at that as well.
Yeah, and indeed, Professor Ramdas Lamb has written about it.
Right.
I have mentioned, these authors in papers that I have written.
Yeah.
So there are a few people here and there who have, tried to kind of, take on the battle and kind of make some impact.
Yeah, and Professor Long will be our guest next week for everybody's information.
Wonderful.
We'll be talking to him. So stay tuned. All right, let's see. Okay, 2 questions from Trishul. There is a trend. Have you shared your output in a polished, published manner and taken this to, firstly, the regulatory body overseeing the media? Going directly to New York Times will not draw their attention. And number 2, have you unearthed who funds the media? I think we have covered this already, but maybe just the first part.
This is where I think people need to understand how the media works in the US. Okay. No newspaper needs a license from the government. The media are free. You only need a license to start a television station or a radio station because of the bandwidth issues. But these days, because of digital communication, even that is not an issue. So there is nothing like an authority that where we can go and complain, okay? Unless, there is, some lies that are published and we have to go to the newspaper and seek, correction and those kinds of things. So there is nothing like, the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, where we can go and say, look, the New York Times is publishing all these negative articles about India. They say, fine, go take it up with the New York Times. So there is no particular authority that we can complain to. And in India, of course, we have the press council. And it's interesting, where Indian newspapers, and that too is changing slightly, but they will not, identify how many people from which group got killed or, got hurt and so on and so forth. They will say one community, clashed with another community and so on. But the same reporters working for the New York Times can do all of those kinds of things. So the press council rules don't apply to the New York Times correspondents in New Delhi, but it applies to the Hindustan Times correspondent in India.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very nuanced observation here, specifically in US context. Okay, and Nandini Singh, a brilliant presentation. Such newspapers have been criticized and snubbed by Donald Trump. In the UK, as well as the Conservatives are also clear of the BBC being pro-labor and on appeasement agenda. There are serious funding issues that dictate the USP of anti-India. Is there a possibility of a conspiracy theory to work with China and Pakistan and Russia that is controlling this hate India narrative?
There have always been conspiracies. After all, if you read Chanakya, the whole world of statecraft is, at one level we can dismiss certain kinds of conspiracies, but politics, statecraft is full of conspiracies. But that apart, and surely, for example, I can say Basharat Peer, who is an opinion page editor for the New York Times, is also a member of the group that I forget the name of it, which is funded by George Soros. I think it's called Open Society. Now I get that. Okay. So Basharat Peer is also a fellow with the Open Society. And George Soros recently at Davos said he would be giving $1 billion to bring about changes in terms of the kinds of narratives. And he said, wherever he sees, I think he mentioned something about nationalisms and so on. Okay. One can connect the dots there. Okay. We can connect the dots in terms of, for example, there's a whole bunch of work on how the Ford Foundation was funding certain kinds of projects in India. Okay. And during Indira Gandhi's time, there's a whole bunch of reports, and Indira Gandhi herself, accusing the CIA of infiltrating, Indian, spaces from academia to media. And that is part of, I think, global affairs of countries who see immediate threats, those kinds of things that are par for the course. Beyond that, I don't have the kinds of resources to track, whose bank account has gotten money from whom, till we make those kinds of connections. It's very difficult to kind of say, these are the people who are directly funding these kinds of people.
Very good. Do you have time for a couple more questions, Professor Rao? Do you have?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So 2 more questions, maybe. All right. Bala, what is the role of second or third generation Indian Americans in this narrative? What resource advice do they have?
Yeah, I think I have an 18-year-old son. He and I, debate quite a lot about these kinds of things. He doesn't always buy my argument because his friends, his cohorts also read a lot of the New York Times, and what appears in certain, the access that the big media have do influence them. And I think it's a multi-pronged effort.
Can you mute your, okay, sorry about that.
Okay. So it has to be a multi-pronged effort. I think our children, first of all, have, we have to, again, walk our talk. If we merely talk, then, it won't influence them. It all depends on the culture at home, what we read and how we present it. But we have to acknowledge this. Here again, very important not to generalize, because I see a lot of second generation, third generation Indian kids who are great musicians, who are, getting into dance and art and so on, and combining stuff, who are also beginning to kind of, at certain points in their life, want to kind of reconnect to their parents or to their grandparents' world and find out, what did they miss? I think that is going to happen. But, I also found that the large majority of the second and third generation Indian American children, especially, call themselves, they are Bernie supporters. Okay. They're part of the American kind of quote unquote mainstream. And we therefore, again, will have to, work with them and say, okay, let's talk, let's debate these kinds of things, rather than saying, oh, this is wrong or this is right. Unless we have the kinds of skills to debate, then we won't win our children or grandchildren.
Yep, that's very important, that we ourselves are well read in our, not just the news, but also our shastras and texts and other texts, Itihasa and Purana as well. Sriraj asks, Professor Rao, congrats on the presentation, a complete set of research findings. The main question that needs to be asked is, how can this discussion and thoughts be made to filter through the grassroots? Media is clear factor. Other thoughts?
Yeah, here again, we all have ideas about who we are, even in terms of our own community or communities. How many watch what, how many read what, how many really are interested in what their kind of ideological inclinations are, and so on. So when we say grassroots, I don't know who are all part of the grassroots. I can only make my case consistently so that it cuts through the kinds of layers. It becomes accessible, and that's the other thing. There, one is about access, the other is about the message. Okay, I may keep sending out the message, but if people don't have the access, then it's a problem. And I think again here, platforms like this, Indic Academy, doing fantastic work. Or for example, I work with Seva International, helping them with their media outreach and so on. It's very important to kind of talk about what people are doing, okay, the good work, and then yes, we will, these things cannot change in a day, but as long as we are doing good work, and this is also very important, that many people get very frustrated, very angry at the kinds of messages, at the kind of depictions of us Hindus and of our civilizational property, that we say, something really angry and stupid, and we basically end up digging holes for ourselves. And it is a huge challenge that I have every morning when I read the New York Times to stop myself from cursing at the screen. Okay. So it takes that kind of both patience and perseverance. There is nothing else that can change the stuff. Unless the world faces some other kind of a threat, and suddenly our sight are changed. We start looking at something else. It's like the coronavirus. But even in the time of coronavirus, there are so many negative articles about India still popping up.
Okay, one more question, Professor Rao, last one.
Sure.
Okay. Does the idea, this is from Harsha Jani, does the idea of International Hindu Consortium coming together to define strategy and provide bursary to train young Hindus in Hindu-centric journalism appeal to you?
We deal with a paradox with Hindu groups. We are not a Hindu group. And I think, I mean, for example, the RSS, the Sangh, Parivar have tried to kind of bring people together under one umbrella, but even they themselves have many umbrellas, mini umbrellas. It is not possible because that is both our strength and our weakness, right? We are a very diverse community. Our Sanatana Dharma is full, I mean, we say 6 major philosophical schools, maybe 100 minor philosophical schools, and 2,000 mini, philosophical schools. That is the real beauty about who we are. And therefore, to kind of think about these kinds of, classic monopolistic organizations that have one church and one, hierarchy, priestly hierarchy and so on, that is not there. So how do we leverage our diversity? How do we convert our quote unquote weakness into a strength? And I think finally it is again, not merely logic, because that's the other thing about Hindu faith groups, that it is not mere faith, because we look for evidence. That's why we have our yogis and seers and others who can take us to the next step of, and here we are kind of moving into the area of reality, of the nature of reality and so on. But that is our strength. And so this whole idea of a global Hindu consortium is kind of, I think it's a mistaken pursuit. People might really kind of, think that will solve. That is not something really, I think is workable.
Well, that was very wonderful and enchanting and educational, Professor Rao, and we thank you very much for coming up here and talking to us. Before we close, I would like to mention quickly about next week's webinar. It's going to be Professor Jeffrey Long, who is going to be talking about misconceptions of Hindu Dharma. It's same time, I think, 10 o'clock Central and 11 Eastern. We'll be sending out information. So please check our social media handles. I would also like to thank Ram, my colleagues here, Ram and Nishant, for getting the logistics taken care of, and talking to Professor Rao and getting the scheduled and working with our India team. And also like to thank our India team and Harikiranji and his office for providing all the logistics here, support for everything that we do here. And thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you next time, next week. Have a good
care, be safe. We live in kind of strange times.
Yes.
So please be safe.
Okay. Thank you and namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste.